Blackthorn Isle was little more than a jagged, forgotten rock, a speck of land lost in the cold, mist-choked waters of the North Sea. The island was only known to those who had to know its sailors, mainly, and they dreaded its name. A few souls had set foot there over the centuries, but none had stayed long. The island's most infamous landmark was its lighthouse, standing tall like a sentinel overlooking the treacherous sea, a decaying monument to lives long lost. No shipwreck near Blackthorn went unclaimed by its relentless waves or sharp, rocky shores, and no soul who came to guard its light ever left unscared. The last keeper of Blackthorn's lighthouse was Ezra Cole, a solitary man with a reputation for being taciturn, but devoted to his duty. For years, he lived in the lighthouse with his wife and young daughter, Alice. It was said that Ezra would spend hours up in the lantern room, staring out into the sea even when there were no ships to guide. His obsession with the light grew more intense with each passing year, as if he feared that if it went out, something far worse than a shipwreck would happen. Then, one stormy night, the light did go out. The next morning, Ezra, his wife, and Alice were gone. No one knew exactly what had happened, but rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed Ezra had gone mad and drowned his family before disappearing into the sea. Others whispered that the island itself was cursed, and that whatever haunted it had finally claimed the Cole family. Regardless, after their disappearance, no one was willing to take over the role of lighthouse keeper. Blackthorn Isle was left to rot, the lighthouse slowly falling into disrepair, its light extinguished forever. But the stories didn't die. Fishermen passing by the island at night swore they saw strange lights flickering in the windows of the lighthouse. Some even claimed they heard voices carried on the wind, calling out for help. No one dared approach the island, except, one night, a man named Daniel. Daniel was a young thrill-seeker, the kind of person who sought out the places everyone else avoided. He had heard the stories of Blackthorn Isle in the local tavern and was intrigued. A ghostly lighthouse, disappearing families. To Daniel, it sounded like the perfect adventure. He dismissed the warnings from the locals as drunken superstition and made up his mind. He would go to Blackthorn Isle and spend the night in the lighthouse. It was a cold autumn evening when Daniel set out in a small rowboat, the sea unnaturally still beneath a thick layer of fog. The island was little more than a dark shadow in the distance, barely visible through the mist. As he drew closer, the lighthouse loomed above him, a crumbling giant silhouetted against the twilight sky. Its once bright light was long gone, the windows shattered, and the stone walls blackened with age. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind sweeping across the sea, but he shook it off. After all, he was here for the thrill. His boat scraped against the rocky shore, and Daniel climbed out, pulling his supplies behind him. The beach was littered with debris, broken timbers, bits of metal, remnants of the many ships that had wrecked on Blackthorn's unforgiving shores. As he made his way up the steep, rocky path to the lighthouse, the air grew thicker, heavier, as if the island itself were watching him. The door to the lighthouse hung crooked on its hinges, creaking as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and damp, the smell of salt water and rot clinging to every surface. The floor was littered with debris, old papers, broken furniture, and seaweed that had blown in from the storm. Daniel raised his lantern, casting a flickering glow over the stone walls. He was alone, for now, as he explored the lower levels. He found remnants of the previous keepers, an old cot, a dusty chest, some personal belongings left behind in a hurry. There was a journal on the table, its pages yellowed and brittle. Curious, Daniel flipped it open. The handwriting was faded, barely legible, but one entry caught his eye. The light is everything. If it goes out, they will come. They ray waiting. They've always been waiting. The entry was dated the night before Ezra Cole and his family vanished. Daniel felt a shiver crawl up his spine. He closed the journal and set it down. It was just a story, he told himself. Just the ramblings of a man who had been too long on a lonely island. He wasn't about to let it get to him. Climbing the narrow, spiraling staircase, Daniel made his way to the top of the lighthouse, the lantern room. The glass panes were cracked and fogged over, casting strange, distorted reflections in the dim light. The large metal apparatus that once held the lantern was rusted and covered in barnacles, long since abandoned to the elements. He stood there for a moment, looking out over the sea, the fog thick and impenetrable. He could barely make out the dark silhouette of the mainland far in the distance. Everything felt wrong. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a heavy, oppressive thing, pressing down on him from all sides. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, too quiet to make out the words, but unmistakably a voice. Daniel spun around, the lantern shaking in his grip. There was no one there, just the shadows and the broken walls of the lighthouse. But the whisper came again, louder this time, closer. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, soft and pleading, carried on the wind. Daniel's heart raced, but he tried to stay calm. The island was playing tricks on him. That's all it was. He needed to get some rest, clear his head. He descended the staircase quickly, but the air seemed to grow colder with every step. By the time he reached the bottom, his breath was visible in the frigid air. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the stone chamber. Daniel rushed to it, pulling it open. But outside, the fog had thickened to the point where he couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him. And then, from the mist, he saw them. Figures, pale, translucent figures drifting toward the lighthouse, their movements slow and deliberate. At first, he thought they were fishermen, maybe curious sailors who had found their way to the island. But as they drew closer, he realized their faces were wrong, hollow, sunken, their eyes nothing more than dark, empty sockets. They weren't alive. Daniel's blood ran cold as the ghosts of Blackthorn Isle closed in, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. "Why did you leave us? You said you would save us. He left us here to die." Panicking, Daniel slammed the door shut and bolted it, backing away into the center of the room. The whispers didn't stop. They were all around him now, filling the lighthouse with a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. And then, standing in the middle of the room, was Ezra Cole. His form was as pale and translucent as the others, but his face was twisted in a look of hatred, his eyes those empty, black pits fixated on Daniel. "You shouldn't have come," Ezra whispered, his voice a rasping croak. "You'll stay here, like me, like them." Suddenly, the shadows came alive, swirling around Daniel like a storm. Cold, clammy hands grabbed at his arms, pulling him to the ground. He struggled, but there was no escape. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the dead faces of Ezra's family, watching him with empty eyes, their mouths silently screaming. The next day, Daniel's boat was found washed up on the mainland, empty. His friends waited for him, But Daniel never returned. Blackthorn Isle remains abandoned, its lighthouse dark, but on stormy nights, sailors still claim to see a faint light flickering in the tower, an eternal signal from those who are forever lost, bound to the cursed island and its endless, ghostly vigil.